Hello, and welcome to the Artfully Learning audio series. I'm your host, Adam Zucker. My guest on this episode is artist and educator Gabo Camnitzer. His 2021 installation, Glorious Wound, examines the use of technology, traditional materials, and differentiated teaching methods utilized in historical and contemporary classrooms and their past and present ramifications on teaching and learning. The work prompts critical thinking around the future of the classroom as an architectural, political, and social space. While the artwork critically scrutinizes materials created for educational purposes, it also highlights the flexibility of educators in light of the many ongoing challenges they face in classrooms today. Hey, Gabo, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you in person or in Zoom format, whatever it is. It's all interchangeable, I guess, now.
Yeah, can't tell the difference anymore.
So welcome to the program, to the Artfully Learning audio series. The tried and true question that I open these conversations with is, it's one that I really like because it's always the most sort of diverse and experiential question when we're talking about art and education. It's, what's your earliest childhood memory of an artistic experience?
So an artistic experience that I understood as artistic at the time, or could it be in hindsight that I reflect on it as being artistic?
I think that's actually a great point because education, it's all about, right, that reflection and assessment.
Yeah.
So yeah, whichever one.
I mean, I guess like early on when I was a kid, I had a lot of trouble with language and like communication. I had some problems with my ears, and I think I had the benefit of like being around artists like growing up, and I think without knowing exactly what was at stake or what was happening, I think the people around me were a lot more adept at communicating in other ways other than language, and I found that really helpful and sort of welcoming. And I think in hindsight now, like working with kids, I'm in some ways like mirroring that behavior in terms of just like understanding that there are a billion different ways to communicate, and in the broadest sense, like art and cultural production like allows us access to so many different ways of actually like communicating with one another, that I think in that way, that was my introduction to seeing like both like the utility of it and like the beauty of art.
How was your current development as an artist and educator nurtured while you were growing up, both at home and school?
Well, I think there was always this pretty serious like clash between the way art was being taught to me in school versus like what I was learning at home. So like, my father's an artist and my mother is like very interested in art. And when I was growing up, my father ran like a printmaking school every summer. And people would come from all over the place to study there. And so I had a lot of access to like different ways of thinking about art and what art could be through just like hanging out there, from a very young age. And that was like an incredible privilege that I think in some ways like it opened my mind in so many ways, but it also like made me all the more sort of antagonistic towards the kinds of art that were being taught to me in like public school. But I think like thinking about art as a mode of communication and as a way of engaging with reality and with society. I think like maybe I didn't have the vocabulary around it, but I think I understood that intuitively quite early, just through the benefit of like the people I was exposed to. And I think at a certain point I rebelled against like the more academic or traditional approach to art education that was happening at school. And while in the moment I found it frustrating and maybe counterproductive, I think in hindsight it was like very formative for me to just be in that like oppositional sort of stance in relation to like the art teachers there. yeah, and I think I'm still sort of like navigating that kind of like in but not of in like my current position, and throughout all my positions, I think.
On that point, I'd like to delve into your work, Glorious Wound, which is a multidisciplinary inquiry-based installation, which focuses on the past, present, and future of childhood. And I experienced it as part of Queen's Museum's Year of Uncertainty, which was responding to many different crises, but in particular, your work focused on the educational crisis prior to, and also especially made more evident in light of COVID-19. So Glorious Wound is just really timely, and it will be timely for better or for worse, I guess, for our foreseeable history, human history. So you could talk a little bit about the inspiration behind that work and what, in general, I guess, an overarching question of what your perspective of where we are at in this current moment in education and where we're headed. So what's the present and the future of childhood and education in general?
Yeah, that's an enormous question that it's still like, yeah, continuously grappling with. I think it's interesting to reflect back on Glorious Wound and like that whole process of working on that project, just because like from its very inception, like it was very speculative in a lot of ways, because I think like early on during the pandemic, I think like a lot of people were like trying to find the potential in the moment for radical change, and it felt like with the uprising and with just like all the mutual aid efforts that were going on, a lot of organizing happening, that there was actually like momentum to push things in a different direction, and so with that in mind, I was doing a lot of research at that time about like different pedagogical models. I mean, that's like, I guess, ongoing research, but I really was inspired by this one sort of historical anecdote from a French pedagogue named Celestine Freinet, who, yeah, is quite known for revolutionizing, at least within alternative circles, like a pedagogical approach. And yeah, his trajectory was really interesting just because he was a school teacher, early 20th century, and yeah, was conscripted into the military in France during World War One, and fought and was injured. I think there's some like controversy or some sort of differing accounts of what exactly had happened, but it was a lung injury, and it seems like it was likely mustard gas that caused it. So he was discharged from the army because of the injury, and he went back to being a school teacher. And on, appearing back in the classroom, he quickly realized that he couldn't project his voice to the same extent that he could before. And yeah, he was working with elementary school children, and this created a problem, in the traditional sense, an obstacle to be overcome. And he, yeah, rather than just like forcing his voice to do something it couldn't do, he rethought his approach to education completely. And what he ended up doing was moving out the rows of desks and chairs and bringing in a printing press, and sort of just like very much inverting the relationship of the classroom to the world. He would take the students out on walks in the surrounding community, and they would interview people around in the neighborhood. And then they would come back to the classroom and sort of like process and internalize information that they had gathered, and then put it to print using the printing press that was at the center of the classroom. So yeah, I think like there was reflecting back to 2020 when I started that project, there was like this hope that through this, and I should say, like, he referred to the lung injury later as his glorious wounds because of the fact that it's this bad thing led to this sort of complete like reevaluation of his approach to teaching, and in the end led to a positive change. So using that as like a jumping off point, I titled this sort of like multi-pronged project Glorious Wound, trying to sort of tap into that feeling of the potential benefit that a crisis might offer. And I think like at the time, or I don't know at the time, but in hindsight, like I feel like I was a little bit naive in that yeah, that hopefulness. And I think like when now reflecting back on that time and reflecting on how the project like unfolded, I think like really thinking about how like education in general, particularly like the mission of, if we can call it that, of public education, is just like a continuous wound. For lack of a better word, and but it is a glorious one, you know. And I think like what early on when working on that project, I was very much thinking about you know, COVID and the sort of like parallel crises that accompanied it as being a glorious wound. But I think, you know, so many of these crises like go back so far that, you know, it's impossible almost to trace the origin point, but it certainly wasn't COVID, right? So COVID just showed us yeah, how bare the system is, you know, how basically it's held together by paper, particularly the education system, but I'd say like public service in general.
Yeah, definitely. Right. I mean, it suffered incredible systemic and material disruptions because of COVID, but that was on the mainstream level, as you just referred to. Also on the mainstream level too is the influence of this competing and incredible partisan ideology, these viewpoints that are competing and really shaping the policy over teaching and learning. And often that doesn't include the teachers themselves or the administrators themselves. And one thing too that I appreciated in your work, it was very educational for me as well, because it introduced me to Freine's methods, who really, looking back at it, I'm looking now more about the history of art education in particular, and accessibility and the disabilities movement, and how really his work could be considered a contribution to that if we go back and look at it, you know. And I think we still need to do a lot in terms of accessibility and access if we're going to talk about inclusion in the classroom. But he's definitely a figure to look back at as we plan ahead for the present and the future. But again, at these competing viewpoints, you know, your work really shows that, you know, what has been done in the past and what's being done in the present, what's really affecting us now. We have the tools and the resources, and your work shows us that. I guess these issues certainly have impacted your work as both an artist and an educator. Both the systemic side and the ideological viewpoints within education and everything. And if you could speak a little bit, I'd like to ask the question about what you, and again, this could be probably hopeful or wishful thinking, but what do you see in your work that has been successful, you know, working with students, because you collaborate with students on a lot of your projects. You're also an educator, so you're in the fray, working directly with these future generations, present and future generations. So what, you know, how have these issues impacted your work as an artist and educator, and what do you see, you know, as the successes, and, you know, how are we working to alleviate some of these issues to make it less stressful for teachers and especially the students?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think like one thing that I found, or I've always found like heartening with organizing, is just like how you can witness solidarity get built, you know, in real time. And I think like there've been many moments throughout the past few years, and I mean prior to COVID as well, in which like the reaction to a crisis sort of creates this mobilization that then makes something possible that wasn't possible before. And I think that just goes back to like the idea behind Glorious Wound. But I think like in general, there's right, I guess there's a few things I could say here. I mean, past few years have been punctuated by moments in which like people that had previously sort of been on opposing sides of certain fights have come together, right? But there's also been increased polarization. But I think like thinking about the education system and specifically public education in New York, I think like the solidarity that was enhanced or strengthened during the past few years, and now with Adams as mayor, between specifically parents and teachers as well as students, like I find it really beautiful and inspiring how just like this group of intergenerational organizers who continuously are pitted against one another by the press, by the media, by politicians, see through that and come together and sort of join forces. So that, I think just understanding and getting to work with so many of these wonderful organizers around educational justice in New York has been one of like the most exciting and inspiring parts of this project. I think like more broadly speaking about my teaching and my approach to education, I think one thing that I'm noticing now is like the trepidation or maybe like the suspicion with which young people are treating electoral politics. And I find that really interesting and really useful, actually, because so often I think electoral politics has been treated as like this sort of vessel where all your political aspirations and fears and energy can be placed. But of course, like electoral politics has a very limited impact. So I think like now there's a frustration with electoral politics and a realization of like their insufficiency. And I think that particularly like with teenagers, I think creates an atmosphere in which there's a thirst to do something more, right? To do something more direct, something more concrete in our everyday lives. And I think that's something that can be fostered through education for really positive, outcomes.
Yeah, I've seen that as well. Even in the younger kids too, when we did, I remember like a tried and true kind of art educational project was that I did it as a kid, and then I sort of replicated it with my students, but I wanted to make it more open-ended because, of course, as we mentioned, things evolve and change, and we find better ways of doing things. And so when I was a kid, we did the project of, I guess it was running our own political campaign. We had to make campaign posters and whatever that entailed. But I just remember, I think it was like I made like a multimedia, mixed media portrait of myself. And so I had the students do that, just research. It was an inquiry-based project. What were the issues they wanted to address? We spoke about that as a class, and then individually or as groups, they went in and created this campaign. And a lot of them did decide to work together, which I thought was great, because when I was doing it as a student, it was more about the individual. And now things have changed and shifted very much in the classroom to the communal aspect, the collective, and having that socialization. And really the kids express their own empathy through things like that. And like you were saying too, that they are getting fed up with the system. I mean, I guess they probably is a reflection from their immediate household, their parents or guardians and community, but they also have their own unique viewpoints on it as well. And I agree that, education is the platform where that can really be nurtured, and they can be given the tools to leave the class and go out into the quote unquote real world, but really where they can actually shape policy. I mean, they should be doing that in their schools. They should be given the, if in a perfect world, they'd have the agency to do it wherever they are, but there's certain, I guess, boundaries that we still need to address and break through. But hearing you say all that, it's great. I mean, there's reason to be optimistic, and a lot of it is because of the students themselves and their creativity. And what I appreciated from Glorious Wound too is that you do begin to see, a healing process in this, and how the whole classroom community can be involved in it. And I think we just need to keep highlighting that and showcasing the work of both the educators and the students, which you've done part of it too. I know you've been doing sort of an oral history kind of, or a interview series with teachers as well, getting their perspectives, how they handle the pandemic. And that's also a valuable resource, because that's something I think we're still trying to figure out. So what's next for you, and any big projects on the horizon or currently?
Yeah, well, first I just want to address what you just said, because I think it's so true. And yeah, particularly the inspiration that I get from the students I work with is really just what keeps me going to an extent. And I think particularly when it comes to it's always dangerous to talk in generalized terms or generational terms, but I feel like there is an increased sense of care for one another with this group of kids that I'm working with now, because I find that there is an awareness of competitiveness and individualism and competition in general that I think our generation, or my generation at least, didn't have. And I think there's a willingness to be vulnerable, there's a willingness to be open and to work together that I think wouldn't necessarily exist to the extent it does without these tough few years we've just passed through. So yeah, I take a lot of it's very heartening to see that, and I hope that it continues to blossom as this generation increases their power as they grow older. In terms of projects on the horizon, I am currently preparing for this collaborative exhibition at this art space in Stockholm called Konsthall. And they have this really wonderful program that they've been doing for, I think it's 11 years now, where every year they invite a different artist to come in and develop a lesson plan or curriculum to be put in place in all the preschools in the area where the art space is, which is in the south of Stockholm, Herkeringen it's called. And so basically they invite artists to design a lesson plan that will then in turn produce some kind of material output, which will then be the focus of an exhibition featuring all the children who are involved. So it's a quite ambitious project because it involves over 500 kids from this whole area. So it's an interesting setup because I haven't worked like this before, where I went to Sweden to do a few days of professional development with the teachers, who will then in turn go to their classes and work with the children. So I won't actually directly work with the children. But yeah, the project that we're working on, and right now the workshops are ongoing, is based on this 100-year-old fairy tale written by this children's author named Herminia Zurmailen, who is known as the Red Baroness because she was a baroness who sort of renounced her class privilege and just wrote communist screeds. And she wrote a story called Why in 1922, in which it tells the story of this young boy, orphan boy named Paul, who's growing up in a poor house, and he's just surrounded by adults, and he's constantly asking why questions of all stripes. So everything metaphysical why questions, as well as very sort of materialist why questions of why are there rich people and why are there poor people. And yeah, I was really taken with this story for many reasons. I think one, it's just a very interesting sort of freeze frame of a moment in history, but also just thinking about the particular kind of I'd say like literature and culture that's focused on in early childhood education, particularly in Sweden now. And the history there is like really interesting because it's among Sweden's early childhood education systems, like among the most progressive, or is considered among the most progressive. But there have been, critiques from people both in Sweden and beyond that there's a specific kind of focus on like a plurality of opinions and sort of like a constructivist notion of what truth can be and so forth that sort of reduces the ability to sort of parse information amongst children, and that later in life leads to a situation where like they just had a election a few weeks ago in which the right wing, the far right, former Nazi party or former neo-Nazi party is now the biggest party in the country. So yeah, just using this story and in all its beauty and all its awkwardness as like a opportunity to reflect with teachers about like the nature of truth within the classroom and how we approach, questions of, right and wrong in a way where we're actually like not necessarily shying away from that, not always like leaning into the nuances, but actually saying, okay, there are situations when we need to establish the argument that's more powerful here, and then the second part of it is just treating the development of questions as an art form in itself, which I think as artists, I think that's fairly obvious to us, but for teachers who aren't specialized in art, and even for artists working within schools, I think like that can be a step away from what they're used to, and I think part of that, like one is just the structures that they're operating within, but I think another is that like since they were very little, they were told that art is a specific thing, and that's like drawing. And so I think what I wanted to do with this project is particularly in relation to like past iterations of the project, which were very sort of like focused on material production of an object that looked like art, was to broaden that understanding of what art could be for the children, so that like, from 4 or 5 years old, they're already thinking about art in this expanded sense as like a way of approaching reality. And developing questions in this case. So the workshop or like the lesson plan basically consists of like some exercises that get the children thinking about their like the social and hierarchical aspects of their learning spaces, and then hearing the story, a shortened version of the story, and then being encouraged to develop why questions in relation to that story, and their why questions will be recorded and then will be the content of the exhibition that happens in November.
It's great that you're using art, which is very subjective, to also point out objectivity and factual information, and being able to scrutinize misinformation through thinking like an artist. And I think that's a misconception a lot of people have about art, which you pointed out too, is that art is not just this fantasy manifestation. It's really heavily based on reality. It's the first actual tangible form of communication that we actually know of. Historically, that's how we've learned about history ourselves and discovered ourselves, is through this means of communication. And you mentioned how that's, moving away from the traditional form of teaching kids about artistic materials and medium into this overarching idea of social sculpture, and how everyone can be an artist, and being an artist is something different than just having artistic talent. It's thinking outside of the box, finding ways to resist certain boundaries, and through our creativity and collaboration to sculpt this new world, based on real tangible issues, creating responses to these issues that are both creative and also can be concrete and help society.
Just thinking about like that approach of like universal accessibility and how that benefits everyone, you know, and I think like so often as elsewhere in the world, like we're treating education as this thing that, okay, we design it as like based on what we think the ideal student is. And then we like try to sort of retroactively make other people fit into it. And of course, like that's just doomed to fail in so many ways. So yeah, I think like there's a lot to talk about there and a lot of really interesting things happening there.
As art teachers, it's like we do have that opportunity to help kids break that mold and do it in this traditional setting. And that's fantastic. And I really thank you for this conversation.
Thanks so much. No, and yeah, I really like everything you're saying really resonates with me. And thanks so much, Adam. All right, you take care now.
Thank you. You too.